In a Victorian home in Portland's Hawthorne neighborhood, a 68-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery was about to face the ultimate betrayal. What started as routine post-operative care took a shocking turn when she came face-to-face with documents that would steal everything she owned. Margaret Chen wasn't your typical vulnerable elderly patient. For 40 years, she had been a high school English teacher, known for spotting deception and reading between the lines. When she encountered her daughter-in-law Sarah arriving with Thao, a notary and official papers, she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated financial crime. Margaret signed what she believed were medical authorizations that would lead to losing her family home and $400,000 in fraudulent loans. What began as trust and family would become a fierce legal battle for justice. The Portland senior community would never be the same after Margaret transformed from victim to advocate, creating support networks protecting elderly citizens from family financial abuse. Her story proved that even when betrayed by those closest to us, it's never too late to fight back and win. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen had built her life on precision. 40 years of teaching high school English had trained her to spot deception in a teenager's excuse, to read between the lines of hastily written essays, to trust her instincts when something felt wrong. But oxycodone had a way of blunting those instincts, wrapping them in cotton wool alongside the persistent ache in her hip. The Victorian house creaked around her as she shifted in the hospital bed they'd installed in what used to be Bill's study. 3 generations of her family had walked these hardwood floors, and she could read the house's moods like a familiar book. Today, though, even the familiar sounds seemed muffled, distant. The medication made everything feel like she was observing her life through thick glass. "Mrs. Chen?" Sarah's voice carried that particular tone Margaret had learned to recognize, the one her daughter-in-law used when she wanted something. Sweet. Careful. "I hope you don't mind. I brought someone to help us get your medical authorizations sorted out." Margaret fumbled for her reading glasses on the nightstand, her fingers clumsy from the pain medication. Where had she put them? Everything seemed to shift locations when she wasn't looking, a cruel reminder of how dependent she'd become on others for the simplest tasks. "This is Bobby Martinez," Sarah continued, gesturing to a young man who hovered near the doorway like he wasn't sure he belonged. "He's a notary public, very professional." Bobby stepped forward, briefcase in hand, his movements careful and practiced. Margaret could see the nervousness in his posture, the way he adjusted his tie, how his eyes darted between Sarah and the documents in his case. Fresh out of training, she guessed. The kind of young professional eager to please, to prove himself competent. "Ma'am," Bobby said, his voice carrying the formal politeness of someone still getting used to his role. "Mrs. Chen has explained that you need some routine medical documentation notarized. Nothing complicated." Sarah moved closer to Margaret's bedside, her smile warm and reassuring. "I know this seems like a lot of paperwork, but it's really just standard stuff. Medical power of attorney, authorization for David and me to handle your care decisions if needed. The doctor said it's smart to have everything in order." Margaret's mind felt sluggish, like trying to think through thick fog. She'd raised David to be responsible, to take care of family. And Sarah? Well, Sarah had always been ambitious, driven, a successful real estate agent who understood paperwork, legal documents. If Sarah said these were routine medical forms, Margaret had no reason to doubt her. "Where are my reading glasses?" Margaret asked, patting the bedside table again. "Oh, you don't need to worry about reading every line," Sarah said quickly, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I've gone through everything with Bobby already. It's all standard language. You know how these legal documents are, full of whereas and heretofore." The important thing is getting your signature so we can make sure you're properly taken care of." Bobby spread the documents across the adjustable bed table, his movements efficient despite the slight tremor in his hands. Margaret could see there were several pages, official-looking letterhead, multiple signature lines. The text swam slightly when she tried to focus on it without her glasses. "The first one is the medical power of attorney," Sarah explained, pointing to signature, lines highlighted with yellow sticky notes. "Then we have healthcare directives and insurance authorizations. Bobby has all the proper seals and everything." Margaret's teacher instincts flickered. Something about Sarah's explanation felt rehearsed, too smooth. But the pain medication wrapped around that concern like a warm blanket, making it hard to hold on to any thought for long. And this was family, David's wife, the mother of her granddaughters. "Where's David?" Margaret asked, suddenly noticing her son's absence. David usually handled these kinds of things with her, had been her rock since Bill's death. Sarah's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes, quick as a shadow passing across a window. "He's at work, couldn't get away, big presentation today, but he reviewed everything last night, said it all looks good." Bobby cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Chen, if you're not comfortable signing without reviewing the documents fully, we can certainly reschedule." No, Sarah interrupted smoothly. "Margaret's had such a hard week with the surgery. The sooner we get this taken care of, the sooner she can focus on recovering." She placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. "Besides, you trust us, don't you? We're family." The word hung in the air like an incantation. Family, trust, the values Margaret had built her life around, the principles she'd tried to instill in David. You took care of family. You trusted family. Family didn't hurt family. Margaret accepted. The pen Bobby offered, its weight unfamiliar in her medication-clumsy fingers. The signature lines seemed to multiply as she focused on them. How many documents were there? The yellow sticky notes guided her hand to each spot, Sarah's voice a constant, soothing presence. "Just there, Margaret. Perfect. And here. One more. Page." The signatures felt foreign as they emerged from her pen, looser than her usual careful script. The oxycodone made even writing feel like an act performed by someone else's hand. But Sarah was smiling, and Bobby was notarizing each page with practiced efficiency, and the whole thing felt official, proper, safe. "All done," Sarah announced, gathering the documents with satisfaction. "Bobby, thank you so much for coming out on such short notice." Bobby packed his supplies, his relief palpable now that the task was complete. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. These medical authorizations are so important to have in place. You're very wise to get them handled." As they prepared to leave, Margaret felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The effort of staying alert, of participating in official business, had drained what little energy the pain medication hadn't already claimed. "You rest now," Sarah said, adjusting Margaret's blankets with practiced care. "David and I will take care of everything else. That's what family is for." The front door closed with a soft click, leaving Margaret alone with the afternoon shadows stretching across her bedroom floor. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the familiar sounds of her Hawthorne neighborhood, children walking home from school, a lawnmower starting up, the gentle hum of life continuing its normal patterns. She closed her eyes and let the medication pull her toward sleep, trusting that she was protected by the same walls that had sheltered 3 generations of her family. The documents were signed, the legal requirements met. Sarah and David would handle the details while she focused on healing. Outside, Portland's autumn rain began to tap against the windows with gentle persistence, a sound that had always meant safety and home. Margaret Chen drifted toward sleep, still believing in the fundamental goodness of family, still trusting that the people who claimed to love her had her best interests at heart. She had no way of knowing that with her careful signatures on those documents, She had just signed away everything her parents had built, everything she and Bill had preserved, everything she had planned to leave her granddaughters. The house, that had been her sanctuary for 68 years, was no longer legally hers. The rain continued its soft percussion against the glass, indifferent to what had just transpired within these walls. And Margaret slept, still innocent of the devastating betrayal that would soon reshape every relationship she'd counted on, every assumption she'd lived by, every definition of family she'd ever known. The rain had stopped 3 weeks ago, but Margaret still found herself listening for it in the quiet moments between visitors and therapy sessions. The oxycodone haze had lifted, replaced by a clearer kind of discomfort, the sharp awareness of muscles relearning movement, of a body demanding its independence back. "Breathe through it, Mrs. Chen," Maria Santos said, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd guided countless patients through recovery. "Your hip is remembering how to trust itself again." Margaret gripped the parallel bars in what used to be her living room, now transformed into a makeshift rehabilitation space. Maria had moved the coffee table against the wall and rolled back the Persian rug, the same rug where Grace and Sophie had played as toddlers, where Bill used to read his engineering journals on Sunday mornings. "My parents would be horrified," Margaret said, managing 3 more steps before pausing. "They treated this room like a museum. No one was allowed to eat in here, let alone exercise." Maria smiled, adjusting Margaret's grip on the bars. "Sometimes we have to make space for what we need, even if it means changing what we've always known." She had an intuitive way of speaking that reminded Margaret of her best students, the ones who understood that learning meant being willing to see familiar things differently. The front door opened with Sarah's distinctive pattern, 3 quick knocks followed by the key turning in the lock. Margaret had given her that key during the dark days after Bill's death, when Sarah had insisted on checking in daily, bringing groceries, handling the mail. "How's our patient today?" Sarah called out, her voice carrying that bright cheerfulness that Margaret had once found comforting. Now, something about it felt slightly off-key, like a piano that needed tuning. "Getting stronger every day," Margaret replied, though she noticed how Sarah's eyes swept the room, cataloging changes, making mental notes of things that seemed to have nothing to do with Margaret's recovery. Maria's hands stilled on Margaret's walking belt. The physical therapist had developed an uncanny ability to read the undercurrents in the house, the way tension shifted when certain people entered a room. Margaret had noticed it too, how Maria's professional warmth became more guarded around Sarah, how her questions became more pointed. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, rifling through the mail she'd collected from the front porch. "I've been having some of your important correspondence forwarded to our house temporarily, just until you're back on your feet. David thought it would be easier than having you worry about bills and paperwork while you're recovering." Margaret paused mid-step. "Forwarded? I didn't ask." "Oh, just the financial stuff," Sarah interrupted smoothly. "Banking statements, insurance papers, the paperwork that piles up when you're not feeling your best. We're handling everything so you can focus on getting better." Maria's expression remained professionally neutral, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around her eyes. The same look she used to see on her students' faces when they sensed something wasn't quite right with a lesson, but couldn't articulate. "What?" "Mrs. Chen," Maria said carefully, "would you like to try walking to the kitchen? The goal is to be managing your own daily activities independently." "Of course she wants independence," Sarah said quickly, "but there's no need to rush things. Margaret, you don't want to overdo it and set back your recovery." The comment hung in the air with an odd weight. Margaret had spent 40 years teaching teenagers to recognize when someone was being overprotective versus genuinely helpful. Sarah's concern felt different lately, more controlling than caring. Later, after Maria had left and Sarah had gone, home with promises to check on things tomorrow, Margaret found herself alone with the late afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains her mother had hung in 1965. The house felt different in these quiet moments, as if it were holding its breath. She eased into Bill's old chair, the leather worn soft from decades of his evening reading, and let herself remember the way he used to handle their finances. Every Sunday morning, he'd spread the bills across the dining room table with engineering precision, checking each statement twice, filing everything in color-coded folders. "Trust but verify," he used to say, a phrase he'd learned from his years working on municipal projects. Even family needs accountability, Maggie. Especially family. The memory brought an unexpected pang of unease. Bill had never fully warmed to Sarah, though he'd been too polite to say so directly. "Something about her doesn't add up," he'd told Margaret once, after Sarah had explained away some inconsistency in her real estate commissions. "The numbers don't match the story." Margaret had defended Sarah then, chalked up Bill's reservations to his engineer's obsession with precision. But now, sitting in his chair, she found herself wondering what he would think about Sarah handling their mail, making decisions about their finances without consultation. The thought prompted her to reach for the phone. She should check on her bank account, make sure the automatic payments were still processing correctly. It was time to start taking control of her own affairs again. The bank's automated system seemed more complicated than she remembered, requiring multiple verification steps. When she finally reached a human representative, the conversation felt off from the start. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen, but I'm showing some recent changes to your account access. It looks like there's been some restructuring of your authorization permissions." "What kind of restructuring?" "Let me transfer you to someone who can better explain the modifications that were made." The hold music seemed to stretch on forever. Margaret found herself studying the room where she'd signed those documents 3 weeks ago, remembering Sarah's soothing explanations, Bobby Martinez's nervous efficiency. "Medical authorizations," Sarah had said, "healthcare directives." When Grace and Sophie arrived for their weekly visit, their presence filled the house with the kind of energy that made everything else fade into background noise. Grace, 16 and sharp as her grandmother had been at that age, immediately noticed the parallel bars in the living room. "Grandma, you're like a warrior recovering from battle," she said, testing the stability of the equipment. "Can you walk across the whole room now?" "Almost," Margaret said, watching Sophie settle at the piano bench and begin picking out a melody she was composing. "Your mom says I'm pushing too hard, but I think I'm ready to start handling my own affairs again." Grace looked up from examining the walking bars, her expression thoughtful. "Mom's been weird lately, really stressed about something. She keeps having these long phone conversations that stop when we walk into the room." Sophie's melody faltered. "And she asked us all these questions about your house last week. Like, how old it is, what Dad thinks it's worth, whether you've ever talked about selling it." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. "She asked you about selling the house?" "We told her you'd never sell," Grace said firmly. "This is our family home. Great-great-grandpa built it. You'd never leave, right?" "Right," Margaret said, but the word felt hollow. Sarah's questions, the redirected mail, the banking complications, the way everyone seemed to be making decisions about her life without including her, it was starting to form a pattern she didn't want to recognize. The girls stayed for dinner, Sophie playing softly while Grace helped Margaret navigate to the kitchen without the walker. As they moved through the familiar motions of family dinner, Margaret tried to shake the growing unease that had taken root in her chest. But as evening fell and her granddaughters headed home, Margaret found herself standing at the front window, watching their car disappear into the gathering darkness. The house felt different now. Not quite as safe as it had 3 weeks ago, not quite as much like the sanctuary she'd always believed it to be. She thought about Bill's Sunday morning ritual, his careful review of every financial document. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start asking her own questions. It was time to trust but verify, even when it came to family. Especially when it came to family. The neighborhood settled into its evening quiet, but Margaret remained at the window, listening to sounds that weren't quite right, feeling currents in her own home that she was only beginning to understand. Margaret remained at the window long after her granddaughter's taillights disappeared, the neighborhood settling into its familiar evening rhythm. But sleep felt impossible now, her mind churning with fragments of conversation that hadn't made sense at the time. Sarah's questions about the house value, the redirected mail, the banking complications that morning. She made her way to Bill's old desk in the corner of the living room, each step deliberate and careful. The parallel bars caught the streetlight from outside, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, like prison bars. The metaphor unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name. The desk drawers yielded little, mostly old utility bills and insurance correspondence that Sarah had been helping organize. But in the bottom drawer, underneath, a stack of Bill's old engineering journals, Margaret found a manila envelope she didn't remember placing there. Her name was written across it in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of addressing it to herself. Inside were photocopies of the documents she'd signed 3 weeks ago. Sarah must have left them for her records, Margaret realized, though she couldn't recall being told about copies. As she spread them across the desk surface, her reading glasses finally located in their proper place, the words began to swim into focus. Medical power of attorney, Sarah had said. Health care. Directives. Routine authorizations. But the heading on the first document read, Grant deed and property transfer. The second, irrevocable power of attorney for financial affairs. The third made her hands shake. Application for home equity line of credit, $150,000. Margaret read each document twice, then a third time. Her teacher's mind, trained to parse dense text and identify key details, began processing what she was seeing. Property transfers, financial control, loan applications. None of this was medical authorization. The phone rang, startling her from her growing horror. The caller ID showed David's number. "Mom, how are you feeling tonight?" His voice carried a tension she'd never heard before, an artificial casualness that immediately put her on guard. After 4 decades of reading teenage deception, she recognized the tone of someone who had something to hide. "David, I need to ask you about some documents." "Documents?" The word came out too quickly, too sharp. "What documents?" "The ones I signed 3 weeks ago. Sarah said they were medical authorizations, but, Mom, you're probably still feeling effects from the medication. Sometimes these legal papers can be confusing. Sarah explained everything to you at the time." The condescension in his voice hit her like cold water. This was her son, the boy she'd raised to be honest, to face problems directly. The man who'd held her hand through Bill's funeral and promised he'd always take care of her. "David Chen," she said, using the tone that had made countless students straighten in their chairs. "Do not speak to me as if I'm senile. I'm looking at a property transfer deed with my signature on it. I need you to explain what's happening." The silence stretched so long she wondered if the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't. Mom, I can't talk about this right now. Sarah handles the financial stuff. You should ask her." The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her son's evasion confirming what the documents had already told her. This wasn't confusion or medication side effects. This was something much worse. The next morning brought a stack of mail that Sarah hadn't intercepted, delivered directly through the mail slot while Margaret was awake early, unable to sleep. Among the usual catalogs and advertisements were 3 envelopes that made her blood run cold. "Congratulations on your loan approval," the first one announced. "Your home equity line of credit for $150,000 has been processed and funds are now available." The second was from a different bank. "Your application for a reverse mortgage has been received and is under review." The third, from a title company, contained dense legal language about property transfer processing and recording fees. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of financial transactions she'd never initiated, loans she'd never applied for, decisions made about her home without her knowledge or consent. The morning light streaming through the windows felt different now, less like the comfort of home, and more like an interrogation lamp illuminating the scope of her betrayal. The doorbell rang just as she was reaching for the phone to call the GR police. Through the peephole, she saw Elena Rodriguez, her former student who lived 3 houses down. Elena had been one of her brightest pupils 20 years ago, inspiring Margaret's pride when she'd graduated law school and began working in legal aid. "Mrs. Chen!" Elena's warm smile faltered when she saw Margaret's expression. "I was hoping to check on your recovery, but you look. Is everything all right?" Margaret found herself unable to speak for a moment. Elena had always been perceptive, even as a teenager. Now, as a seasoned attorney specializing in elder law, she seemed to read the situation with professional clarity. "May I come in?" Elena asked gently. "You look like you could use someone to talk to." They settled at the kitchen table, the loan documents spread between them like evidence at a crime scene. Elena's expression grew darker as she reviewed each page, her legal training evident in the way she examined signature lines, dates, and notarization details. "Mrs. Chen," Elena said finally, her voice carefully controlled, "these are not medical authorizations. This is a complete transfer of your property ownership and financial control to Sarah Chen." "I know," Margaret whispered. "I figured that out last night, but I don't understand how. I trusted her. She's family." Elena's jaw tightened. That's exactly why this type of fraud is so devastating, and so common. She pointed to specific sections of the documents. "Look here. This power of attorney gives Sarah complete control over your finances, your property, your medical decisions. And this property transfer? It legally makes her the owner of your house." "But I only meant to sign medical papers. I was on pain medication, couldn't find my glasses." "None of that matters legally, once your signature is notarized." Elena's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen this scenario too many times. What matters is proving these signatures were obtained through deception and undue influence. Margaret felt something shift inside her, the same feeling she'd experienced years ago when she'd caught her first student cheating on an exam. The initial shock and disappointment giving way to cold, determined anger. "What do I do?" she asked, meeting Elena's eyes directly. "How do I fight this?" Elena smiled, and Margaret glimpsed the determined teenager who'd once declared her intention to use law to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. "We start by documenting everything, every conversation, every financial transaction, every time Sarah has made decisions without your consent." Elena gathered the documents into a neat stack, and then we show Sarah Chen that she picked the wrong family to defraud. Outside, the morning continued its normal progression. Neighbors heading to work, school buses making their rounds, the ordinary rhythm of a life Margaret had thought was secure. But inside the house that had sheltered 3 generations of her family, everything had changed. Margaret Chen, retired English teacher and recent victim of elder abuse, was discovering that some lessons in life came not from textbooks, but from betrayal. And some students, decades later, became the teachers when the stakes were highest. The real education was just beginning. The real education was just beginning. And Margaret intended to be an excellent student. She spent the rest of the morning with Elena, organizing documents and preparing for what they both knew was inevitable. By the time Sarah's key turned in the front door that afternoon, Margaret was ready. "Margaret?" Sarah's voice carried its, usual cheerful cadence as she entered the living room. "How are you feeling today? I brought some groceries and—" Her words died as she took in the scene. Margaret seated at the dining room table, documents spread before her like evidence in a courtroom, Elena Rodriguez sitting beside her with the professional composure of an attorney. Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment, before reasserting itself with practiced ease. "Elena, what a surprise! I didn't know you were visiting today." "I'm here in a professional capacity," Elena said calmly, her voice carrying the authority. Margaret remembered from parent-teacher conferences, polite but unmistakably serious. Margaret picked up the property transfer deed, her hands steady despite the tremor of rage building in her chest. "Sarah, I need you to explain something to me. 3 weeks ago, you told me I was signing medical authorizations. But this document transfers ownership of my house to you." Sarah's laugh came too quickly, too high. "Margaret, sweetheart, you're still recovering. Sometimes the medication can make things seem confusing. Stop." Margaret's voice cut through the air with 40 years of classroom authority. "Do not insult my intelligence. I taught teenagers for 4 decades. I know manipulation when I see it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sarah's mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "I don't know what Elena has been telling you, but Elena didn't tell me anything I couldn't see for myself." Margaret held up the loan approval notice. $150,000 home equity line of credit that I never applied for. A reverse mortgage application with my forged signature. "Sarah, you've stolen my house." Sarah's composure began to crack. "That's ridiculous. You're my family. I would never what?" Elena interjected, consulting her legal pad. "Would never exploit an elderly woman recovering from surgery? Would never manipulate someone under the influence of pain? Medication to sign documents they couldn't read? Would never commit elder financial abuse, which, by the way, is a felony in Oregon?" Sarah's face flushed red. "You have no right to interfere in family business." "Family business?" Margaret's voice rose, decades of suppressed teacher's fury finally finding its target. "Family doesn't steal from family, Sarah. Family doesn't lie to someone who trusts them completely." The front door opened again, and David's voice called out tentatively. "Sarah? Mom? I saw Elena's car outside and thought—" He stopped dead when he entered the dining room, taking in the documents, the tension, his wife's defensive posture. "David," Margaret said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "Perfect timing. I need you to explain how my property transfer deed has your signature on it as a witness." David's face went white. He looked at Sarah, then at the documents, then back at his mother with the expression of a child caught in an elaborate lie. "Mom, I can explain." "Then explain." Margaret stood slowly, her physical therapy paying off as she faced her son without assistance. "Explain how you watched your wife trick me into signing away everything your father and I built. Explain how you let her forge documents while I was helpless in a hospital bed." "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," David said, his voice barely audible. We needed help, Mom. Sarah's investments went bad, and the mortgage company was going to foreclose. So you decided to steal my home instead?" Margaret's words came out like ice chips. "You decided to defraud your own mother?" Sarah stepped forward, her mask finally dropping completely. "Don't act so righteous, Margaret. You were going to leave everything to David anyway. We just accelerated the process. Without my knowledge, without my consent. While I was vulnerable and dependent on you for care." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. "You violated every trust, broke every bond that should have been sacred." "Sacred?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "This house is just bricks and wood. It's not some shrine to your perfect little family legacy. Do you know what it's worth in today's market? David and I could have made something of ourselves with that money, instead of waiting around for you to die." The words hung in, the air like a slap. Elena reached for Margaret's arm, but Margaret shook her head. She needed to face this moment on her own. "Get out," Margaret said quietly. "Mom," David started. "I said get out." Margaret's voice filled the room with the authority of someone who had commanded respect for decades. "Both of you, get out of my house." "Your house?" Sarah's desperation made her voice shrill. "It's legally my house now. You signed it over. That deed is recorded at the county courthouse." Elena stood, her professional demeanor shifting into something more dangerous. "Actually, Sarah, documents obtained through fraud, forgery, and undue influence can be challenged and reversed. And elder financial abuse carries both civil and criminal penalties that can include restitution, fines, and prison time." Sarah's bravado crumbled. "David, tell them we didn't mean for it to go this far." But David was staring at his mother with something that might have been shame finally surfacing through his weakness. "Mom, I'm sorry. I never wanted." "Sarah said it would be simple, that you'd understand eventually." "I understand perfectly," Margaret said. "I understand that my son and his wife saw my vulnerability as an opportunity. I understand that you were willing to make me homeless, to solve your financial problems. I understand that when I needed family most, you chose greed instead." She walked to the front door and opened it, her movement steady despite the emotional earthquake shaking her foundation. "I want you both out of my house. Now. And if either of you sets foot on my property again without a court order, I'll call the police." Sarah gathered her purse with jerky, angry movements. "You'll regret this, Margaret. Fighting this will cost you everything in legal fees. You'll end up losing the house anyway." "Maybe," Margaret said calmly. "But I'll lose it on my terms, not because I was betrayed by people I loved." David paused at the door, looking back at his mother with something that might have been recognition of what he'd lost. "Mom, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "Don't," Margaret said firmly. "Don't make this worse with apologies you don't mean." She closed the door behind them and turned the deadbolt with deliberate finality. Through the window, she watched Sarah storm to her car while David lingered on the front walkway, looking back at the house with an expression of someone realizing he'd just burned down everything that mattered. Elena remained at the dining room table, gathering the documents into organized stacks. "Margaret, I need you to know, this is going to be a fight, but we're going to win it." Margaret returned to her chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 68 years. The house felt different now, not just because of what she'd learned, but because the people she'd trusted most had revealed themselves to be strangers. "Elena," she said quietly, "will you help me understand what happens next?" Elena's smile was fierce with professional determination. "Next, we show them what happens when they underestimate a retired teacher who spent 40 years dealing with liars and bullies." Outside, Sarah's car pulled away with an angry screech of tires. But Margaret Chen remained in the house her parents had built, surrounded by evidence of betrayal, but no longer alone in facing it. The family she'd been born into had failed her completely. But the family she was choosing to build, that was just beginning. The family she was choosing to build was just beginning, and Elena Rodriguez wasted no time in making it official. 2 hours after Sarah's angry departure, Margaret's dining room had been transformed into a war room. Elena spread legal forms across the polished mahogany surface, while her phone buzzed with calls to colleagues, court clerks, and investigators. "The first priority is getting an emergency injunction to prevent any further financial transactions," Elena explained, her pen moving efficiently across petition forms. "Then we challenge the validity of every document you signed, starting with the property deed." Margaret watched Elena work with the focused intensity she remembered from parent-teacher conferences 20 years ago. Elena had been the kind of student who turned every assignment into a crusade for justice, even back then. Now, that same determination was being directed at unraveling Sarah's web of deception. How long will this take? Margaret asked, settling into her chair with a cup of tea that had grown cold during the confrontation. Weeks, possibly months. But Margaret, I need you to understand something. Elena looked up from her paperwork, her expression serious. This isn't just a civil matter anymore. What Sarah did, the forgery, the fraud, the exploitation of your medical vulnerability, these are crimes. We need to involve law enforcement. The word crimes settled in Margaret's chest like a stone. For 68 years, she'd lived a life where the worst deceptions were teenagers claiming their homework was eaten by dogs. Now she was a victim of felony elder abuse, perpetrated by people she'd loved and trusted without reservation. The doorbell rang, and Margaret tensed. But Elena's smile was reassuring. That should be Detective Morrison. I called him while you were making tea. Detective Ray Morrison looked like Central Casting's idea of a thorough investigator. Mid-50s, graying at the temples, with the patient eyes of someone who'd seen enough human nature to be surprised. By very little. But when he shook Margaret's hand, his expression carried a personal weight that went beyond professional courtesy. Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that financial elder abuse cases are a priority for our department. And this particular case. He settled into the chair Elena indicated, pulling out a well-worn notebook. This one matters to me personally. My grandmother was victimized by a family member 3 years ago, lost her entire retirement savings to a grandson she'd helped raise. Margaret found herself studying the detective's face, recognizing the familiar combination of love and betrayal that she was still learning to navigate herself. What happened to him? Prison. 3 years. But Grandma never recovered from the emotional damage. Morrison's voice carried the weight of experience. That's why I want to make sure we build this case correctly. Sarah Chen is going to face the full consequences of what she's done. Over the next 2 hours, Morrison methodically documented everything. The timeline of Margaret's surgery and recovery, the circumstances of the document signing, Sarah's behavior patterns, David's complicity. His questions were thorough but gentle, revealing an understanding of how difficult it was for victims to accept that family members could be perpetrators. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask about the notary who witnessed your signatures. Robert Martinez? Bobby, Margaret said. Young man seemed nervous. Sarah said she'd hired him. Elena looked up from her notes. I tracked down his contact information. He agreed to meet with us tomorrow. Good, Morrison said. The notary's testimony will be crucial. If Sarah misrepresented the nature of the documents to him as well, it strengthens our fraud case significantly. The phone rang, interrupting their discussion. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and felt her chest tighten. David's number. Don't answer it, Elena advised. Not until we have legal protections in place. Margaret let it go to voicemail, but the ringing felt like an accusation. Her son was trying to reach her, and she was refusing his calls. 6 months ago, such a scenario would have been unthinkable. Morrison continued his methodical documentation, requesting banking records and financial statements. Elena tells me you've been having difficulty accessing your accounts? Sarah had been handling my mail, redirecting financial correspondence. When I tried to check my balance yesterday, the bank said there had been authorization changes to my accounts. That fits the pattern, Morrison said grimly. Financial predators typically establish control over their victims' information flow early in the process. It makes it harder for the victim to discover the fraud until significant damage has been done. Maria Santos arrived as they were wrapping up, her physical therapy equipment in hand and her intuitive radar immediately sensing the tension in the room. When Elena explained the situation, Maria's reaction was swift and fierce. I knew something was wrong with that woman, Maria said, settling her equipment against the wall. The way she watched you during therapy, calculating things, like she was measuring your progress against some timeline only she knew about. You sense that? Margaret asked. My mother was exploited by a cousin when I was young, I learned to recognize the signs. Maria's voice carried the authority of experience. Predators have a way of moving through vulnerable people's lives like they own them. Sarah had that energy. As Detective Morrison prepared to leave, he handed Margaret his card with both his office and personal numbers. Mrs. Chen, I want you to call me if Sarah or David attempts to contact you. If you notice any unusual activity around your house, or if you feel unsafe in any way. These cases can escalate when the perpetrators realize they're being investigated. After he left, Elena and Maria remained, their presence filling the house with a different kind of family energy than Margaret had ever experienced. Elena sorted legal documents while Maria guided Margaret through gentle exercises, both women creating a protective circle around her that felt more solid than blood relations had ever managed. Elena, Margaret said as evening approached, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me. Why are you doing this? I mean, I was your teacher 20 years ago, but this goes far beyond old-school connections. Elena paused in her document organization, considering her answer carefully. Do you remember what you told me when I was struggling with whether to go to law school? Margaret shook her head. You said that intelligence without purpose was just cleverness, but intelligence combined with a moral compass could change the world. You said I had both, and that I had an obligation to use them for people who couldn't protect themselves. Elena's smile was soft with memory. You changed my life, Margaret. You made me believe I could make a difference. And now you're returning the favor? Now I'm proving you were right about me. The phone rang again. David's number. This time. Margaret didn't even glance at it. Some relationships, she was learning, had to be earned back through actions, not words. And some people had to prove they were worthy of trust before that trust could be extended again. Outside, Portland's evening settled over the Hawthorne neighborhood with its familiar rhythms. But inside the Victorian house that 3 generations of Chens had called home, something new was being built. Not just a legal case, but a different kind of family, one based on choice, loyalty, and shared values rather than accident of birth. Margaret Chen was discovering that the strongest bonds weren't always the ones you were born into. Sometimes they were the ones you fought for, defended, and earned through mutual respect and unwavering support. Tomorrow would bring Bobby Martinez's testimony, deeper investigation into Sarah's financial desperation, and the beginning of a legal battle that would test everyone's resolve. But tonight, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her rather than against her, Margaret felt stronger than she had since before her surgery. The real work was just beginning. But Margaret hadn't anticipated how quickly the ripple effects would reach the most innocent members of her family. Grace and Sophie arrived Tuesday afternoon while Elena was reviewing witness statements. Their school backpacks dropped at the front door, with the heavy finality of burdens being shed. Grandma, Grace said without preamble, her 16-year-old directness cutting through any possibility of gentle introduction. Kids at school are saying Dad and Mom stole your house. Is that true? Margaret felt her carefully constructed composure waver. She'd spent hours with Elena discussing how to handle this conversation, but all their preparation couldn't cushion the raw pain in her granddaughter's voice. Sophie, 14 and more emotionally fragile than her older sister, had settled at the piano bench but wasn't playing. Her hands rested motionless on the keys, and Margaret could see unshed tears threatening to spill over. Girls, Margaret said, moving carefully to the couch where she could face them both. Come sit with me. We need to talk. Elena quietly gathered her papers, preparing to leave them privacy, but Margaret gestured for her to stay. Elena is helping me with some legal problems. She was my student once, just like you are now, and I trust her completely. Grace perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid with barely controlled emotion. Sophie curled up next to Margaret, seeking the physical comfort that had always been available in this house. Your parents made some very poor financial Decisions, Margaret began, choosing her words with the same care she'd once used to explain difficult literature to her students. When people get desperate about money, sometimes they make choices that hurt the people they love. But did they steal from you? Grace pressed, her intelligence demanding specifics rather than gentle euphemisms. Margaret met her granddaughter's eyes directly. Grace deserved honesty, even when it was devastating. Yes, they tricked me into signing papers that gave them control of this house and my bank accounts. I thought I was signing medical forms while I was recovering from surgery. Sophie's tears finally spilled over. That's why Mom's been so weird lately, and why Dad won't look at us when we ask questions. How did you find out? Margaret asked gently. Jessica Martinez's older brother is Bobby, Grace said. The notary? He told his family what really happened, and word got around school. Kids were asking us if it's true that our parents are criminals. The word criminals hung in the air like an accusation against the adults who were supposed to protect these girls from such harsh realities. Margaret felt the weight of having to shield them from truths that were simultaneously too adult and too immediate to ignore. What happens now? Sophie asked, her artist's sensitivity making her particularly attuned to the emotional undercurrents swirling around them. Elena spoke up for the first time. Now we work to fix what was broken, but that process might be difficult for your family. The girls spent the afternoon at Margaret's house, doing homework at the dining room table while Elena worked quietly on legal briefs. The normalcy felt precious and fragile, like a bubble that could burst at any moment. That evening, Grace and Sophie returned to their parents' house to find David pacing the living room while Sarah spoke in urgent, hushed tones on the phone. When the girls walked in, Sarah's conversation stopped abruptly. "Where have you been?" Sarah demanded, her usual composure replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "At Grandma's," Sophie said simply. Sarah's face hardened. "I don't think that's a good idea right now. Your grandmother is—" She's not thinking clearly. The medications from her surgery, the stress of recovery. She's confused about some legal documents and causing problems for our family. Grace, who had inherited Margaret's ability to recognize deception, crossed her arms. "Mom, we know what really happened. Half the school is talking about it." David looked up from his pacing, his face gray with exhaustion and guilt. "Girls, it's complicated. Adult situations that you don't fully understand." "We understand enough," Grace interrupted, with the devastating clarity that only teenagers could manage. "We understand that you lied to Grandma when she was helpless. We understand that you stole her house. We understand that Bobby Martinez is telling everyone how you tricked him too." Sarah's desperation made her voice shrill. "Your grandmother has been poisoning you against us. She's a bitter old woman who can't accept that she needed help managing her affairs." Sophie's quiet voice cut through her mother's hysteria. "Grandma never said a bad word about either of you. She just told us the truth when we asked." "The truth?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "The truth is that your precious grandmother was going to leave you nothing. She was talking about donating this house to charity when she died. David and I were trying to preserve your inheritance." David finally found his voice, though it cracked with strain. "Sarah, stop. Don't drag the girls into this." "They're already in it," Sarah snapped. "Everyone at school knows. The neighbors are talking. We're going to lose everything because your mother can't accept that we were trying to help her." Grace stood up, her teenage dignity impressive in its quiet authority. "Mom, you weren't trying to help anyone but yourselves, and now you're lying. To us the same way you lied to Grandma." She took Sophie's hand, pulling her younger sister toward the door. "We're going back to Grandma's house. At least there, people tell us the truth." "You can't just leave," Sarah called after them, her voice desperate. "This is your home. We're your parents." Sophie turned back at the door, her artist soul expressing what her older sister couldn't. "This doesn't feel like home anymore. And parents are supposed to protect their children, not use them as weapons against their grandmother. The girls walked the 3 blocks to Margaret's house in gathering twilight, their school backpacks feeling heavier with each step. When Margaret opened the door, Grace's composure finally cracked. "Grandma," she said, her voice breaking, "can we stay here tonight? I don't want to go home." Margaret opened her arms, gathering both girls into the kind of embrace that had comforted 3 generations of her family. "Of course you can stay. This is your home too, for as long as you need." As they settled into the guest room that had been David's childhood bedroom, Sophie asked the question that had been haunting them both. "Do you think Dad knew it was wrong when he helped Mom?" Margaret considered her answer carefully, sitting on the edge of the bed where she'd once tucked David in as a child. "I think your father is a weak man who made terrible choices when he was scared. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it might explain it." "Will we ever be a normal family again?" Grace asked, her teenage need for certainty battling against her growing understanding that some things couldn't be fixed. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "But I know that families aren't just about blood relations. They're about people who choose to love and protect each other, no matter what. And you two will always have that with me." Outside, Portland's familiar evening sounds continued their gentle rhythm. Traffic, distant music, the ordinary progression of life in a neighborhood where most families weren't dealing with criminal investigations and betrayal. But inside, the Victorian house, a different kind of family was taking shape, one built on truth instead of deception, on choice instead of obligation, on love that was proven through actions rather than proclaimed through words. Margaret Chen was learning that some of life's most important lessons came not from textbooks, but from watching how people behaved when they thought no one was keeping score. And her granddaughters were learning that sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was choose truth over convenience, even when that truth shattered everything you thought you knew about the people who were supposed to love you most. The legal battle was far from over, but the moral one had been decided by 2 teenagers who chose integrity over loyalty to people who had betrayed the most fundamental trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new tests of everyone's character. But tonight, 3 generations of women slept safely under the same roof, protected not by blood ties, but by the unshakable bonds of chosen family and unwavering truth. Tonight, 3 generations of women slept safely under the same roof, but safety, Margaret was beginning to understand, was more fragile than she'd ever imagined. The realization came 2 days later, during what should have been a routine trip to the grocery store, her first venture out alone since Grace and Sophie had moved in. She was comparing prices on coffee when Sarah appeared at the end of the aisle like a predator who'd been tracking her prey. Gone was any pretense of the caring daughter-in-law. Sarah's appearance was disheveled, her eyes carrying a manic energy that made Margaret's teacher instincts scream warnings. "Margaret," Sarah said, her voice carrying false sweetness layered over something much darker. "How nice to see you out and about. I was beginning to think you were hiding from us." Margaret's grip tightened on her shopping cart, using it as both support and barrier. "I'm not hiding from anyone, Sarah. I'm simply living my life." "Your life?" Sarah stepped closer, close enough that Margaret could smell the stale coffee on her breath, see the sleepless exhaustion in her bloodshot eyes. "That's interesting, considering you're trying to destroy mine." Other shoppers moved around them, oblivious to the tension crackling between the 2 women. Margaret felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with her recovering hip. This was public enough to feel safe, yet isolated enough for Sarah to say things she wouldn't dare voice elsewhere. "I'm not trying to destroy anything," Margaret replied carefully. "I'm trying to recover what was stolen from me." Sarah's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Stolen? You signed those documents willingly. You gave us permission to help you. And now you're ungrateful enough to call it theft? I gave you permission based on lies. That's called fraud, Sarah." "Fraud." Sarah repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Do you know what fraud is, Margaret? Fraud is letting your family struggle while you sit on $1 million property, doing nothing. Fraud is making David feel like a failure his entire life, while you hoard resources that could change everything for us. Margaret felt her composure wavering, not from Sarah's accusations, but from the raw desperation she saw in her daughter-in-law's eyes. This was a woman on the edge of something that looked dangerously like a complete breakdown. Sarah, if you and David were having financial problems, you should have talked to me. We could have worked something out. Worked something out? Sarah's voice rose enough to attract attention from nearby shoppers. Like what? A loan with your precious conditions and judgments? A handout that came with lectures about fiscal responsibility? Margaret recognized the trap Sarah was trying to create. A public scene that would paint Margaret as the unreasonable family member, the cruel matriarch who refused to help her struggling relatives. But 40 years of managing teenage drama had taught her not to take the bait. I think this conversation is over, Margaret said quietly, beginning to push her cart toward the checkout. Sarah's hand shot out, gripping the cart's handle with enough force to stop its movement. This conversation is over when I say it's over. You have no idea what you've started, Margaret. No idea what you're going to lose. The threat was subtle, enough to maintain plausible deniability, but clear enough to make Margaret's blood run cold. Sarah released the cart and walked away, leaving Margaret standing in the coffee aisle with the distinct feeling that the stakes of their conflict had just changed dramatically. That evening, while Grace worked on homework and Sophie practiced piano, Margaret called Detective Morrison. She threatened you? Morrison's voice carried the sharp attention of someone whose protective instincts had been activated. Not in so many words, but yes, I think she did. Mrs. Chen, I need you to understand something. Financial criminals often escalate when their schemes are exposed. The money Sarah has already accessed from fraudulent loans against your property, she's probably spent it, which means she's trapped. Desperate people make dangerous choices. The next morning brought confirmation of Morrison's concerns. Margaret woke to find her back door slightly ajar, the lock mechanism damaged in a way that suggested forced entry. Nothing appeared to be missing, but Elena's carefully organized legal files had been disturbed, scattered across the dining room table as if someone had been searching for specific documents. She was looking for something, Elena said grimly, photographing the scene before anything was touched. Probably the original documents or anything else that could strengthen our case. Morrison arrived within 20 minutes, bringing with him a crime scene photographer and a locksmith. Mrs. Chen, I'm implementing immediate security protocols, new locks, security system, and regular patrol checks of your neighborhood. Is that really necessary? Margaret asked, though the violation of her home's sanctity had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Yesterday's threat? Last night's break-in? Yes, it's necessary. Sarah Chen is escalating, and we need to assume she'll continue to do so. The security system installation was completed by afternoon, transforming Margaret's peaceful Victorian home into something that felt more like a fortress. Grace and Sophie adapted to the new reality with the resilience of teenagers, but Margaret could see the stress in their faces, the way they checked locks and glanced toward windows with new awareness. Elena's investigation had uncovered even more disturbing developments. 3 additional fraudulent loans, she reported during their evening strategy session, all taken against your property in the past 2 weeks. Sarah's been busy since our confrontation. How much? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Combined with the original home equity line? Nearly $400,000 in unauthorized debt secured by your house. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. $400,000. More than her teacher's pension would ever cover. More than she could possibly repay even if she sold the house. Sarah hadn't just stolen from her. She'd created a financial catastrophe that could destroy everything Margaret's family had built over 3 generations. Meanwhile, Bobby Martinez was facing his own pressure. Elena had arranged for him to provide, additional testimony about the document signing. But when he arrived at her office, his nervous energy had transformed into something closer to fear. "Mrs. Chen called me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Chen. She said if I testified against her, she'd make sure I lost my notary license for not following proper procedures." Elena's expression hardened. "Bobby, that's witness intimidation. It's another crime we can add to her growing list." "But what if she's right? What if I did mess up? I'm new at this, and she seemed so sure about the medical authorization stuff." Margaret studied the young man's face, recognizing the self-doubt that Sarah had weaponized against both of them. "Bobby, we were both manipulated by someone, very skilled at deception. That doesn't make us guilty of anything except trusting the wrong person." David appeared at Margaret's door that evening, his appearance as disheveled as Sarah's had been at the grocery store. Grace and Sophie were upstairs doing homework, and Margaret was grateful they wouldn't witness their father in this state. "Mom, you have to stop this," he said without preamble. She's not handling the stress well. I'm scared of what she might do." "Then help us," Margaret replied. "Testify about what really happened. Help us prove the fraud so we can end this legally." David's face crumpled. "I can't. She's my wife, the mother of my children. If I testify against her..." "She's already destroyed our family, David. The question is whether you're going to help clean up the mess or continue to enable her destructive behavior. You don't understand the pressure she's under. The gambling debts, the threats from creditors." "I understand that desperation doesn't justify criminal behavior," Margaret interrupted. "And I understand that you're choosing to protect someone who would sacrifice anyone, including your own daughters, to save herself." David left without another word, and Margaret watched through her new security cameras as he sat in his car for nearly 10 minutes before driving away. Whatever internal battle he was fighting, he was losing it badly. That night, as Margaret checked and double-checked the new locks, she reflected on how quickly her quiet recovery had transformed into something resembling a war zone. Sarah's desperation was metastasizing into something dangerous and unpredictable, threatening not just Margaret's financial security, but her physical safety. But tomorrow would bring them one step closer to court, one step closer to justice. Elena had built a formidable case. Detective Morrison had documented every threat and escalation, and Bobby Martinez had found the courage to stand by his testimony despite Sarah's intimidation attempts. Margaret Chen had spent 40 years teaching students that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to do what was right despite being afraid. Now she was living that lesson, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her even as the risks escalated beyond what any of them had imagined. The house her parents had built still sheltered her, but it no longer felt like the sanctuary it had once been. Safety, she was learning, wasn't about locks and security systems. It was about having people who would fight alongside you when the world became dangerous. And as threats multiplied and stakes escalated, Margaret was discovering just how many people were willing to stand in that fight with her. And as threats multiplied and stakes escalated, Margaret was discovering just how many people were willing to stand in that fight with her. The morning of the court hearing arrived with Portland's characteristic autumn drizzle, the kind of persistent rain that had always made Margaret feel contemplative. But today, as she stood before her bedroom mirror adjusting the navy blue suit she'd worn to countless parent-teacher conferences, contemplation gave way to a steely determination she hadn't felt since her first day of teaching 40 years ago. Grace knocked softly on the door. "Grandma? Elena's here." Margaret took one last look at her reflection. The woman staring back at her bore little resemblance to the vulnerable patient who had signed Sarah's fraudulent documents 3 months ago. This woman had weathered betrayal and emerged stronger, had faced threats and refused to be intimidated, had chosen truth over the comfortable lies that family loyalty often demanded. The courtroom of Judge Patricia Huang occupied the 3rd floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse, its high ceilings and mahogany paneling designed to convey the gravity of legal proceedings. Margaret had never been inside a courtroom before. 40 years of teaching had involved plenty of difficult conversations with parents and administrators, but never anything requiring judicial intervention. Elena moved through the space with professional confidence, her legal files organized with the same meticulous attention to detail Margaret remembered from her student days. Detective Morrison sat in the gallery's first row, his presence both reassuring and sobering. This wasn't just about recovering stolen property anymore. Sarah faced criminal charges that could result in prison time. "Mrs. Chen," Elena said quietly, reviewing her notes one final time. "Remember what we discussed. Answer the questions directly, tell your story truthfully, and don't let Crawford intimidate you. You've faced down teenagers for 4 decades. One defense attorney shouldn't be too challenging." Margaret nodded, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. Grace and Sophie flanked her, their teenage faces serious with the weight of watching their family's destruction play out in public. They'd insisted on being present despite Margaret's concerns about the difficult testimony they would hear. "I need to see this," Grace had said with 16-year-old determination. "I need to understand exactly what Mom did, so I can decide what happens next." The defendant's table across the aisle presented a carefully constructed tableau. Sarah sat beside her attorney, James Crawford, a man whose expensive suit and practiced confidence suggested he specialized in making victims appear unreliable. Sarah herself had been transformed by professional styling: conservative gray suit, understated makeup, hair pulled back in a manner that suggested maternal concern rather than criminal desperation. But Margaret could read the signs Crawford's stylist couldn't disguise: the tight grip on her purse handle, the way her eyes darted toward the gallery where David sat alone in the back row, separated from his daughters by choices that had destroyed their family. The slight tremor in her hands that suggested sleepless nights and the kind of stress that no amount of courtroom preparation could fully mask. "All rise," the bailiff announced with ceremonial authority. The Honorable Judge Patricia Huang presiding over the matter of Chen versus Chen, case number CV 2024-8847. Judge Huang entered with the measured bearing of someone who had spent 20 years navigating the complexities of family law. She was smaller than Margaret had expected, but her presence filled the courtroom with an authority that transcended physical stature. As she reviewed the case files spread before her, Margaret caught glimpses of an expression that suggested this was far from her first encounter with elder financial abuse. Elena rose for her opening statement with the confidence Margaret remembered from parent-teacher conferences, but magnified by professional expertise and righteous anger on behalf of her former teacher. "Your Honor, this case represents one of the most calculated and egregious examples of elder financial abuse that has come before this court. Margaret Chen, a 68-year-old retired educator recovering from hip replacement surgery, was deliberately deceived by her daughter-in-law, Sarah Chen, into signing documents that transferred her property and complete financial control while she was vulnerable, medicated, and physically unable to read the papers placed before her." Elena's voice carried the measured authority of someone presenting irrefutable facts rather than making arguments. "The evidence will show that Sarah Chen exploited Mrs. Margaret Chen's medical vulnerability, not out of family concern, but as part of a calculated scheme to solve her own desperate financial situation at her mother-in-law's expense." She moved to the evidence table, where bankers' boxes contained the documentation of Sarah's betrayal. Bank records showing unauthorized transactions totaling $400,000. Loan applications bearing Mrs. Chen's signature for debts she never incurred. Medical records proving her medication levels during the fraudulent document signing. Phone records documenting Sarah Chen's increasingly desperate communications with creditors in the weeks preceding this calculated deception. Margaret watched Sarah's face during Elena's presentation, seeing micro-expressions that revealed the toll of maintaining her innocent facade. A slight tightening around the eyes when Elena mentioned the gambling debts. A barely perceptible flinch when the amount of fraudulent loans was announced. The practiced calm of someone who knew she was caught but hoped skillful legal representation might still provide escape. Your Honor, Elena continued, this wasn't a family misunderstanding or a well-intentioned effort to help an elderly relative manage her affairs. This was predatory criminal behavior directed at a vulnerable woman by someone who exploited the most sacred trust, the trust between family members. Crawford's opening was predictably different, attempting to reframe Sarah's criminal behavior as misunderstood family assistance complicated by Margaret's post-surgical confusion. Your Honor, what we have here is a family tragedy born of miscommunication and the natural difficulties that arise when elderly relatives require care assistance. Mrs. Margaret Chen, while certainly a capable woman in her prime, was dealing with the effects of major surgery, prescription pain medication, and the natural stress of dependence after a lifetime of independence. His strategy was becoming clear. Paint Margaret as confused and Sarah as well-intentioned. Transform criminal fraud into family miscommunication. Margaret felt her teacher instincts bristling at the condescension in his tone. Mrs. Sarah Chen, far from exploiting her mother-in-law, was attempting to help manage complex financial matters during a difficult recovery period. The documents in question were signed willingly by Mrs. Margaret Chen, who understood she needed assistance with her affairs. Elena's first witness was Bobby Martinez, whose nervous energy was immediately apparent as he took the oath. His hands shook slightly as he settled into the witness chair, but his voice grew stronger as Elena guided him through the events of that day 3 months ago. Mr. Martinez, please tell the court about your interaction with Mrs. Sarah Chen on the day in question. She contacted me through my online notary service, Bobby began, his voice careful and measured. She said her mother-in-law needed routine medical authorizations notarized for her recovery care. Healthcare directives, medical power of attorney, insurance forms. That's what she told me. And based on that information, what preparations did you make? I brought my standard medical documentation supplies. I reviewed the basic procedures for healthcare directives. I prepared to witness what I believed would be routine elder care paperwork. Elena moved closer to the witness stand. When you arrived at Mrs. Margaret Chen's home, what did you observe about her condition? Bobby's guilt was evident in his expression. She was clearly recovering from surgery. She was in a hospital bed in what looked like a temporary setup. She seemed groggy, maybe from medication. She kept looking around for her reading glasses. Did you express any concerns about her ability to understand the documents she was signing? I started to suggest we postpone until she could review everything clearly, but Mrs. Sarah Chen assured me that everything had been explained previously, that these were just formalities that needed to be completed for insurance purposes. Crawford's cross-examination was aggressive, designed to make Bobby appear incompetent rather than deceived. Mr. Martinez, isn't it true that you were inexperienced at the time of this notarization? I was newly certified, yes. And isn't it true that proper notarization procedures require you to ensure the signer understands the documents they are signing? Bobby's voice strengthened with determination Margaret recognized, the moment when someone decides to stop, accepting blame for another person's deception. Mr. Crawford, I followed the procedures I believed were appropriate for the documents I was told I was witnessing. Mrs. Sarah Chen deliberately misrepresented the nature of those documents to both Mrs. Margaret Chen and to me. But you didn't insist that Mrs. Margaret Chen read each document thoroughly? Because I believed they were routine medical forms that had already been explained to her. If I had known these were property transfers and financial powers of attorney, I would have required private consultation with Mrs. Chen. I would have insisted she read every line. I would have asked detailed questions about her understanding of the legal implications. Elena's redirect allowed Bobby to explain the full scope of Sarah's deception. Mr. Martinez, in your professional opinion, was Mrs. Sarah Chen's description of these documents accurate? Absolutely not. She told me they were medical authorizations. The actual documents transferred property ownership and complete financial control. No reasonable notary would treat those as equivalent to healthcare directives. Detective Morrison's testimony provided the criminal context that elevated the case beyond civil fraud. His methodical presentation of evidence painted a comprehensive picture of Sarah's escalating desperation and increasingly dangerous behavior. Detective Morrison, please describe the pattern of behavior you observed from Mrs. Sarah Chen after she learned her fraudulent scheme had been discovered. Morrison consulted his notes with professional thoroughness. Initially, Mrs. Sarah Chen attempted to gaslight Mrs. Margaret Chen, claiming she was confused from medication. When that failed, she escalated to threats during a grocery store encounter. When legal proceedings began, she broke into Mrs. Chen's home, attempting to retrieve or destroy evidence. Did this behavior concern you from a public safety perspective? Absolutely. Financial elder abuse often escalates when the perpetrator realizes their scheme has been discovered. Mrs. Sarah Chen's behavior fit classic patterns of increasing desperation and aggression when confronted with consequences. Elena's presentation of financial evidence was devastating. Bank statements projected on screens showed the systematic looting of Margaret's accounts. Loan documents bearing her signature revealed the scope of Sarah's unauthorized borrowing. Credit reports demonstrated how Sarah had destroyed Margaret's financial standing to fund her own gambling addiction. "Your Honor," Elena said, pointing to highlighted figures on the displayed statements. "Mrs. Sarah Chen didn't just steal from Mrs. Margaret Chen. She created a financial catastrophe that could have left a 68-year-old woman homeless and destitute." When Margaret's turn came to testify, she felt 40 years of classroom authority settling around her like familiar armor. Crawford thought he could intimidate her the way teenage bullies had once tried to challenge her authority. In front of their peers, he was about to learn otherwise. Elena's direct examination allowed Margaret to tell her story completely, her voice growing stronger with each answer. "Mrs. Chen, please describe your relationship with your daughter-in-law prior to your surgery." "I trusted Sarah completely. She was David's wife, the mother of my granddaughters. When my husband died 5 years ago, Sarah was one of the people who helped me through that difficult time. I gave her a key to my house, added her to my emergency contacts, consulted her about financial decisions. She was family." "And on the day you signed these documents, what did Sarah tell you about their nature?" "She said they were routine medical authorizations for my recovery care, healthcare directives, medical power of attorney, insurance forms. She emphasized that they were just formalities, that David had reviewed everything, that I shouldn't worry about reading every detail because it was all standard language." "Mrs. Chen, you taught high school English for 40 years. Are you capable of reading and understanding legal documents when you're not impaired by medication?" Margaret's smile was slight, but confident. "I spent 4 decades teaching teenagers to read complex literature, to understand subtext and implication, to recognize when authors were trying to deceive readers through misdirection. Legal documents are challenging, but they're not more difficult than helping a 16-year-old understand Hamlet." Crawford's cross-examination revealed his strategy immediately. "Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that you were heavily medicated during your recovery? That you were dependent on family members for basic care?" Margaret met his gaze directly, drawing on decades of experience with challenging students who thought they could outsmart their teacher. "Mr. Crawford, I was medicated for pain management, not mental incapacitation. I was physically dependent on others for some activities, but my mental faculties were intact enough to recognize manipulation and deception if I had been given accurate information about what I was signing." "But you admit you couldn't read the documents clearly?" "I admit I trusted family members who told me I was signing medical authorizations. That trust was violated through deliberate deception. My temporary inability to read small print while medicated doesn't make me mentally incompetent. It makes me the victim of a carefully planned fraud." Crawford pressed harder, attempting to paint Margaret as a confused elderly woman whose judgment had been compromised. "Mrs. Chen, isn't it possible that your medication affected your memory of these events? That you're misremembering what Mrs. Sarah Chen told you?" Margaret's response carried the authority of someone who had faced down decades of teenage attempts at manipulation. "Mr. Crawford, I taught high school students for 40 years. My job required me to distinguish between honest mistakes and deliberate deception, between confusion and calculated misbehavior. Your client didn't take advantage of my confusion. She deliberately created it. She saw my vulnerability as an opportunity, my trust as weakness to be exploited." Elena's redirect allowed Margaret to explain the full impact of Sarah's betrayal. "Mrs. Chen, how has this experience affected your relationship with your family?" Margaret's voice carried the weight of deep personal loss. "It's destroyed it. My son chose to enable his wife's criminal behavior rather than protect his mother. My granddaughters have been forced to choose between their parents and their grandmother because of actions they had no part in creating. Trust that took decades to build was shattered in a single afternoon of deliberate deception. And beyond the financial impact, how has this affected you personally?" "I spent my career teaching young people that actions have consequences. That trust is precious, that family means protecting each other rather than exploiting each other. Sarah Chen violated every principle I tried to instill in my students. She turned my home, which had sheltered 3 generations of my family, into a crime scene. She made me doubt my own judgment, question my own memories, fear for my own safety." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But she also showed me the difference between legal family and chosen family. The people who have supported me through this, Elena, Detective Morrison, my physical therapist Maria, even Mr. Martinez. They've proven that the strongest bonds aren't always the ones you're born into. Sometimes they're the ones you earn through loyalty, honesty, and courage." The turning point came during Elena's closing argument, when Sarah's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Elena was detailing the extent of the fraudulent loans, $400,000 in unauthorized debt secured against Margaret's property, when Sarah shot to her feet with desperate fury. "She was going to die anyway!" Sarah's voice rang through the courtroom with the raw desperation she'd been suppressing for months. "That house was just going to sit there while David and I lost everything. We needed help now, not after she's dead." Crawford grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back into her seat, but Sarah shook him off with manic strength. "You want to talk about family? Family helps family." Margaret was selfish, hoarding resources while we struggled with real problems. I was trying to save our daughter's future, secure their inheritance before it got donated to some charity. Judge Huang's gavel cut through Sarah's outburst with sharp authority. "Mrs. Chen, you will control yourself in my courtroom or be held in contempt." But the damage was complete. Sarah's mask had fallen away entirely, revealing the entitled desperation that had driven her criminal behavior. Her own words had provided more damning testimony than Elena could have elicited under oath. Crawford's closing argument was a futile attempt to minimize the impact of his client's courtroom breakdown, but the jury of facts had already rendered its verdict. Judge Huang took only 20 minutes to reach her decision. When she returned to the bench, her expression carried the weight of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by greed and betrayal. The evidence presented to this court demonstrates clear and convincing proof of elder financial abuse, fraud, and deliberate exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Mrs. Margaret Chen's testimony was credible, consistent, and supported by extensive documentation. Mr. Martinez's testimony confirmed that the documents were obtained through deliberate misrepresentation. Detective Morrison's investigation revealed a pattern of escalating criminal behavior. Margaret felt Grace's hand slip into hers as the judge continued. Furthermore, this court finds that Mrs. Sarah Chen engaged in a calculated, premeditated scheme to defraud Mrs. Margaret Chen of her property and financial autonomy while she was physically vulnerable and dependent on family care. The defendant's outburst during these proceedings revealed her true motivations, not family concern, but personal greed disguised as assistance. Judge Huang's eyes found Margaret's across the courtroom. "Mrs. Chen, you have demonstrated remarkable courage in standing up to family members who betrayed the most fundamental trust. Your decision to seek justice despite personal cost shows the strength of character that clearly served you well during your teaching career." The judge's final pronouncement was comprehensive. The property transfer deed, power of attorney, and all related loan applications obtained through this fraudulent scheme are hereby declared null and void. Mrs. Margaret Chen's property ownership and financial autonomy are fully restored. Additionally, this court is referring evidence of Mrs. Sarah Chen's criminal behavior to the District Attorney's Office for prosecution. As the gavel fell for the final time, Margaret felt something profound shift inside her chest. Not just relief or vindication, but a deep sense of justice served and truth acknowledged. The legal system had seen through Sarah's manipulations, recognized the reality of Margaret's experience, and provided the protection that family loyalty had failed to offer. Elena's embrace was fierce with professional satisfaction and personal joy. "We did it, Margaret. We proved that truth matters more than blood relations." Grace and Sophie wrapped their arms around their grandmother, their relief palpable after months of uncertainty about their family's future. Detective Morrison offered his congratulations with the satisfied expression of someone who had seen justice properly served after too many cases where it wasn't. As they filed out of the courtroom, Margaret caught sight of David in the back row. His face was gray with the recognition of what his wife had done, what he had enabled through his moral cowardice, and what he had lost through his failure to protect his mother when she needed him most. Their eyes met for a moment, and Margaret saw something that might have been shame finally breaking through his denial and self-deception. Outside the courthouse, Portland's afternoon sun felt different on Margaret's face, brighter, warmer, carrying the promise of a future that was once again her own to determine. The house her parents had built was still hers. The legacy she'd planned to leave her granddaughters was secure. The trust that had been shattered could begin the slow, selective process of rebuilding with people who had proven themselves worthy of it. But as they walked toward Elena's car, Margaret understood that some victories came with permanent costs. The family she'd known was gone forever, destroyed by betrayal and the kind of greed that transformed love into exploitation. The relationships she'd treasured had been revealed as fragile constructs that couldn't survive the test of desperation and moral compromise. Yet in place of what had been lost, something stronger had emerged. Elena's fierce loyalty that transcended their teacher-student relationship. Detective Morrison's unwavering commitment to justice. Bobby Martinez's courage to tell the truth despite personal cost. Grace and Sophie's wisdom in choosing integrity over blind family loyalty. Margaret Chen had lost a family built on assumption and obligation, but she had gained one built on choice and principle. And as they drove away from the courthouse where justice had finally been served, she realized that some transformations, however painful their origins, led to stronger foundations than what they replaced. The legal battle was over, but the real work of rebuilding, her life, her relationships, her understanding of what family truly meant, was just beginning. And for the first time in months, Margaret looked forward to that challenge with hope, rather than fear. The legal battle was over, but the real work of rebuilding, her life, her relationships, her understanding of what family truly meant, was just beginning. And for the first time in months, Margaret looked forward to that challenge, with hope rather than fear. The drive from the courthouse passed in contemplative silence, Portland's familiar neighborhoods rolling past the car windows like scenes from a life she was slowly reclaiming. Elena broke the quiet as they approached Margaret Street. "There's going to be paperwork to complete the property restoration, banking authorizations to reverse Sarah's access, credit reports to clean up. But Margaret, The hard part is over. Everything else is just administrative cleanup. Grace, seated behind her grandmother, leaned forward. What happens to Mom now? The question hung in the air with the weight of consequences that would ripple through their family for years. Detective Morrison, following them in his unmarked police car, had already explained the criminal process that would unfold over the coming months. She'll face criminal charges, Margaret said gently. Elder abuse, fraud, forgery. The judge made it clear that what she did wasn't just a civil matter. It was criminal behavior that will have serious consequences. Sophie's voice was barely audible from the back seat. Will she go to prison? Margaret turned to face her granddaughters, seeing in their faces the same combination of justice-seeking and familial love that had torn at her own heart throughout the legal proceedings. These girls were trying to balance their anger at their mother's betrayal with the fundamental bonds of family that couldn't be severed even by criminal behavior. I don't know, Margaret answered honestly. That will depend on many factors, whether she pleads guilty, whether she shows genuine remorse, whether the prosecutor decides to offer a plea agreement. But yes, prison is a real possibility. As they pulled into Margaret's driveway, the house looked different somehow. Not just because it was legally hers again, but because it felt like home in a way it hadn't since before her surgery. The security cameras Detective Morrison had installed still monitored the entrances, but they no longer felt like necessary protections against family members who might harm her. Maria Santos was waiting on the front porch, her therapy equipment, bag indicating she'd planned this as a working visit despite the court hearing. But when she saw their faces, the exhaustion mixed with relief, the weight of family dissolution balanced against the joy of justice served, she set her professional materials aside and opened her arms for embraces that had nothing to do with physical rehabilitation. How did it go? Maria asked, though their expressions had already provided the answer. We won, Elena said simply. Complete victory. The judge declared all of Sarah's documents null and void, restored Margaret's property and financial control, and referred the case for criminal prosecution. Maria's smile was fierce with satisfaction. Good. That woman picked the wrong family to victimize. As they settled into the living room, the same space where Sarah had orchestrated her fraud 3 months earlier, Margaret felt the significance of reclaiming this territory. The parallel bars from her physical therapy had been moved aside, replaced by the comfortable furniture arrangements she'd maintained for decades. But the room's emotional geography had been permanently altered by everything that had transpired within these walls. Elena, Margaret said, I need to ask you something that's been on my mind throughout this whole process. What you've done for me goes far beyond legal representation. You've become something like family, and I'm not sure how to properly thank you for that. Elena's response carried the warmth of someone whose professional calling had become deeply personal. Margaret, do you remember the conversation we had when I was 17? I was struggling with whether to pursue law school, whether I was smart enough to make a difference in people's lives. Margaret nodded, though the memory was hazy among thousands of similar conversations with students over the years. You told me that the law could be either a career or a calling, and that the difference lay in whether I used it to serve myself or to serve justice. You said I had the intelligence and moral compass to make it a calling, but only if I chose cases that mattered more than money. Elena's voice carried the weight of a promise fulfilled. This case mattered, Margaret. Not just because of the legal issues, but because it was about protecting someone who had protected and inspired so many others. Grace looked up from her homework, which she'd spread across the coffee table with the adaptability teenagers showed in making any space their own. Elena, will you keep being our lawyer? I mean, for other things that might come up? Of course. But more than that, I hope I'll be your friend and advocate for whatever challenges you face going forward. The first of those challenges arrived. 2 days later in the form of David, who appeared at Margaret's front door with the hesitant bearing of someone who knew he had no right to expect welcome but hoped for mercy anyway. Margaret answered the door herself, having decided that this conversation couldn't be avoided indefinitely. "Mom," David said, his voice carrying exhaustion that went deeper than sleepless nights. "Could we talk, please?" Margaret studied her son's face, seeing echoes of the boy she'd raised alongside the man who had betrayed her trust. His appearance was disheveled in a way that suggested the court hearing had shattered whatever illusions he'd maintained about his wife's behavior and his own complicity. "David, if you're here to defend Sarah or make excuses, I'm not," he interrupted quickly. "I'm here to apologize, to admit that everything you said about my choices was right, to ask if there's any possibility of earning back some small part of your trust." Margaret stepped aside, allowing him to enter the house where he'd grown up, where his own children now lived because their parents' choices had made their original home uninhabitable. They sat in the living room where David had played as a child, where he'd brought Sarah to meet his parents 15 years earlier, where his daughters now did homework under their grandmother's care because their family had imploded through greed and moral cowardice. "David," Margaret began, her voice carrying the measured authority she'd once used for parent conferences when discussing troubled students. "I need you to understand something. The apology you owe me isn't the biggest one you need to make. Your daughters have been living here for weeks because they couldn't bear to be in the same house with parents who lied to them, manipulated them, and destroyed their sense of family security." David's face crumpled with recognition of damage that went far beyond financial fraud. "I know. I've failed them in ways I'm still discovering. Sarah tried to turn them against you, and when that didn't work, she blamed them for being disloyal to their parents. And where were you during these attempts at manipulation?" "Hiding," David admitted, the word carrying the weight of self-recognition that had been years in the making. "I was hiding from Sarah's anger, from your disappointment, from the girls' questions I couldn't answer honestly. I was a coward, Mom. I let Sarah destroy our family rather than stand up to her." Margaret studied her son's face, looking for signs of genuine transformation versus temporary remorse. 40 years of teaching had given her extensive experience with both. "David, what has Sarah told you about the criminal charges she's facing?" "Her lawyer says she'll probably have to plead guilty to avoid a longer prison sentence. 2 to 4 years, maybe less with good behavior." David's voice broke slightly. "She keeps saying it's all your fault, that you could have dropped the charges if you'd wanted to be merciful to family. And what do you think about that?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands with the expression of someone finally confronting truths he'd avoided for months. "I think Sarah committed crimes against her own family, and that consequences for criminal behavior aren't optional based on family relationships. I think she would have destroyed you financially if Elena hadn't stopped her. I think." He looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes for the first time since entering the house. "I think I enabled all of it by being too weak to stop her." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, which would take much longer to earn, but recognition that David was finally seeing their situation clearly. "What do you want from me, David?" "I want to earn back the right to be your son. I want my daughters to be able to respect me again. I want to prove that the man you raised is still somewhere inside the coward who let his wife steal from his mother." The conversation was interrupted by Grace and Sophie returning from school, their expressions immediately wary when they saw their father in the living room. The girls had been thriving in Margaret's care, grades improving, confidence rebuilding, the constant tension that had marked their final weeks at home gradually fading. "Dad," Grace said with careful neutrality, "what are you doing here?" "I came to apologize to your grandmother, and to both of you. I know I failed to protect you from what was happening between your mother and grandmother. I should have been honest with you from the beginning." Sophie, more emotionally vulnerable than her sister, moved closer to Margaret's chair as if seeking protection. "Are you going to make us come home? Because we don't want to live with Mom anymore." David's face showed the pain of recognition that his daughters no longer considered their family home a safe space. "No, sweetheart. You're both safer and happier here. I wouldn't ask you to change that." "But you're still married to Mom," Grace pointed out with 16-year-old logic. "How are we supposed to have a relationship with you when she's facing criminal charges for what she did to Grandma?" It was a question that cut to the heart of the family's fractured dynamics. David couldn't rebuild relationships with his mother and daughters while remaining married to someone who had committed crimes against them all. "I've filed for separation," David said quietly. "I can't stay married to someone who would victimize my mother and manipulate my children. The divorce will be final before Sarah's criminal trial begins." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and sadness at this news. Relief that David was finally taking a moral stand. Sadness that it had taken criminal prosecution to force him to choose between his wife and the rest of his family. Over the following weeks, a new routine emerged in the Victorian house that had sheltered 3 generations of Chens. Grace and Sophie attended school from their grandmother's address, their official guardianship transferred through court proceedings that formalized what had already become their reality. David visited twice a week, gradually rebuilding relationships that required him to prove trustworthiness through consistent actions rather than words. Margaret's transformation from victim to advocate began almost accidentally. Maria, during one of their regular therapy sessions, mentioned that her supervisor at the rehabilitation center had been asking about Margaret's experience with elder abuse. "There's a support group for seniors who've been victimized by financial fraud," Maria explained, as she guided Margaret through exercises designed to maintain her mobility and strength. "The facilitator thinks your story could help other people who are struggling with family betrayal." "I'm not sure I'm ready to talk publicly about what happened," Margaret said, though she found herself intrigued by the possibility of helping others who had faced similar situations. "You don't have to decide immediately. But Margaret, you've shown incredible courage in standing up to people who tried to exploit your vulnerability. Other seniors in similar situations could benefit from seeing that it's possible to fight back and win." The first support group meeting Margaret attended was held in a community center conference room, 15 seniors arranged in a circle of folding chairs. Their stories varied in details but shared common threads: family members who had exploited trust, financial institutions that had failed to protect vulnerable accounts, legal systems that seemed designed to favor younger, more aggressive family members over elderly victims. Margaret listened to story after story of betrayal and exploitation, seeing echoes of her own experience in each account. But she also heard something else: a sense of helplessness, a belief that fighting back was impossible or too costly to attempt. When the facilitator asked if she wanted to share her story, Margaret found herself speaking with the same authority she'd once used to command classroom attention. "My name is Margaret Chen, and 6 months ago I was where many of you are now. I had been victimized by my daughter-in-law, who stole my house and $400,000 while I was recovering from surgery. I felt helpless, betrayed, and convinced that family loyalty meant I had to accept what had been done to me." The room's attention focused on her with the intensity of people desperate for hope. "But I learned something important during my legal battle. We're not helpless just because we're older. We're not required to accept abuse because it comes from family members. And we're not alone in fighting back if we're willing to ask for help from people who deserve our trust." Margaret described Elena's legal advocacy, Detective Morrison's thorough investigation, the support system that had emerged around her case. She talked about the court victory, but also about the personal costs, the family relationships that had been permanently altered, the trust that would take years to rebuild. "I won't lie to you," Margaret concluded. "Fighting back against family members who exploit us is one of the hardest things we'll ever have to do. But the alternative, accepting victimization to preserve relationships with people who don't respect us, is worse." After the meeting, several participants approached Margaret with questions about legal resources, with requests for contact information for attorneys like Elena, with expressions of gratitude for showing them that successful resistance was possible. Elena, who had attended the meeting at Margaret's invitation, was approached by 3 different seniors who needed legal representation for their own elder abuse cases. "Margaret," Elena said as they drove home afterward, "I think you found your calling for this next phase of your life." The criminal proceedings against Sarah unfolded over the following months with the systematic thoroughness that Detective Morrison had promised. Sarah's attorney negotiated a plea agreement that would spare her a lengthy trial in exchange for a guilty plea to multiple felony counts of elder abuse and fraud. Margaret attended the sentencing hearing with Grace and Sophie, wanting them to see that actions truly did have consequences, that justice could be served even when it affected people they had once loved. Sarah, dressed in the orange jumpsuit of pre-sentencing custody, looked like a different person from the confident real estate agent who had orchestrated the fraud. Her gambling addiction, fully exposed during the legal proceedings, had been the driving force behind her criminal behavior. The money she'd stolen had been lost to casino debts and desperate investment schemes within weeks of its theft. Judge Huang sentenced Sarah to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation during which she would be required to make restitution payments to Margaret. The sentence was at the high end of the plea agreement's range, reflecting the judge's view that elder abuse deserved serious consequences. As they left the courthouse after Sarah's sentencing, Grace asked the question that had been haunting all of them. "Do you think she'll ever really understand what she did to our family?" Margaret considered her answer carefully, drawing on decades of experience with students who had made serious mistakes. "I think Sarah understands that her actions had consequences for her. Whether she understands the pain she caused to other people, that's harder to say. Some people learn from their mistakes and become better. Others just learn to avoid getting caught. Which kind do you think Mom is?" "I honestly don't know, Grace, but I know which kind you and Sophie are, and that gives me hope for the future." The house gradually returned to something resembling normal life, though the definition of normal had been permanently altered. Elena became a regular dinner guest, her friendship with Margaret deepening beyond their attorney-client relationship. Detective Morrison stopped by occasionally, checking on their security and sharing updates about other elder abuse cases his department was investigating. Maria's role evolved from physical therapist to trusted friend and advisor, her intuitive understanding of family dynamics making her an invaluable source of support as Margaret navigated the complexities of rebuilding relationships with David while maintaining appropriate boundaries. David's transformation was slower and more difficult than his daughter's adaptation to their new living situation. He attended family therapy sessions, worked to understand how his passivity had enabled Sarah's criminal behavior, and gradually proved through consistent actions that he was capable of putting his mother's and daughter's well-being above his own comfort. But it was Margaret's growing role as an advocate for elder abuse victims that provided the most meaning in her post-trauma life. She spoke at community centers, testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger protections for seniors, and worked with Elena to develop educational materials about recognizing and preventing financial exploitation. "You know," Elena said during one of their regular strategy sessions for the advocacy work, "I think Sarah did something she never intended. She turned you into exactly the kind of person who will make sure other seniors don't go through what you experienced." Margaret smiled, looking around the dining room where they'd first organized her legal defense, where they now planned community education programs and legislative advocacy. "Maybe that's the real victory," Margaret said. "Not just getting my property back, but discovering that I had strength I didn't know I possessed, and using that strength to help others who are facing what I faced." Grace looked up from her homework, scattered across the same table where legal documents had once threatened her grandmother's future. "Grandma, do you think our family is going to be okay?" Margaret considered the question, looking at her granddaughters who had chosen truth over convenient loyalty, at Elena, whose friendship had proven more reliable than blood relations, at the community of seniors who now looked to her for guidance and hope. "I think our family is going to be different from what it was," Margaret said. "Some relationships that we thought were unbreakable turned out to be very fragile, but other relationships that we might have taken for granted have proven to be incredibly strong." She gestured around the room, encompassing not just the physical space, but everything it represented. The security that had been threatened and restored, the trust that had been betrayed and rebuilt with more deserving people, the love that had been tested and proven genuine. "This house has sheltered 3 generations of my family. Now it's sheltering a 4th generation, along with chosen family members who have earned their place here through loyalty and love rather than accident of birth. I think that makes us not just okay, but stronger than we were before." Outside, Portland's evening settled over the Hawthorne neighborhood with familiar rhythms. But inside the Victorian house, something new had taken root, a family structure based on choice rather than obligation, on proven trustworthiness rather than assumed loyalty, on shared values rather than shared genetics. Margaret Chen had lost the family she was born into, but she had gained something more precious, the family she had consciously chosen to build, one relationship at a time, one act of mutual support at a time, one demonstration of genuine love at a time. The legal victory had restored her property and financial security, but the personal victory, the transformation from victim to advocate, from isolated elder to community leader, from someone whose trust had been betrayed to someone who could recognize and nurture trustworthy relationships, that victory would last for the rest of her life and benefit countless others who would find strength in her example. As Margaret tucked her granddaughters into bed in the same rooms where their father had once slept, she realized that some stories of betrayal and loss were actually stories of discovery and growth in disguise. The family she had now was smaller than the one she'd started with, but it was built on foundations that could weather any storm. And that, Margaret thought as she turned off the lights and checked the locks that now protected what truly mattered, was worth everything she had endured to find it. And that, Margaret thought as she turned off the lights and checked the locks that now protected what truly mattered, was worth everything she had endured to find it. But the true measure of transformation, she was learning, wasn't found in single moments of reflection. It revealed itself in the accumulated weight of ordinary days, in the routine choices that built new patterns of living, in the gradual recognition that the person she had become was stronger than the person she had been. 6 months after the court victory, Margaret stood before a room of 40 seniors at the Multnomah County Community Center. No longer the vulnerable patient who had signed Sarah's fraudulent documents, but someone whose story had become a beacon of hope for others facing similar betrayals. The monthly support group she had helped establish had grown from 15 participants to a waiting list of people desperate for guidance and community. "Before we begin today's session," Margaret said, her teacher's voice carrying easily to the back of the room, "I want to introduce Elena Rodriguez, the attorney who not only saved my home but helped me understand that fighting back against family abuse isn't just possible, it's necessary." Elena stepped forward with the confident bearing that had served them both so well in court. Her legal aid practice had expanded significantly since Margaret's case, with referrals coming from support groups, community organizations, and word-of-mouth recommendations from clients whose cases had been successfully resolved. "Mrs. Chen's case taught me something important about the law," Elena told the assembled seniors. "Justice isn't just about winning in court. It's about restoring dignity to people who have been told they're powerless, about proving that age doesn't make us vulnerable to exploitation. It makes us experienced enough to recognize when someone is trying to take advantage of us." The audience, mostly women in their 70s and 80s, though several men and some middle-aged children of victimized parents were scattered throughout, listened with the intensity of people who had found their experiences validated for the first time in months or years. Margaret had learned to read these faces, to recognize the stages of processing that elder abuse victims went through. Shame at having been deceived by family members, anger at their own perceived gullibility, fear that fighting back would make their situations worse, and underneath it all, the desperate hope that someone would tell them they weren't powerless, that their experiences mattered, that justice was possible even when it came at great personal cost. Today we're going to hear from 3 people who took action against family members who were exploiting them, Margaret continued. Their stories are different in details, but they share something important: the courage to prioritize their own well-being over family loyalty when that loyalty was being used as a weapon against them. The first speaker was Dorothy Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, whose son had been slowly draining her retirement accounts through fraudulent power of attorney documents. With Elena's legal help and Margaret's emotional support, Dorothy had not only recovered most of her stolen savings, but had seen her son sentenced to 18 months in prison for financial elder abuse. The hardest part wasn't the legal proceedings, Dorothy told the assembled group, her voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had survived family betrayal and emerged stronger. The hardest part was accepting that my son, the child I raised, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally, saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person deserving respect and protection. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. But what I learned through this process is that real family doesn't exploit vulnerability. Real family protects it. The people who supported me through this fight, Margaret, Elena, the other members of this group, they showed me what family actually looks like. The second speaker was James Morrison, a 72-year-old widower whose daughter-in-law had convinced him to sign over his house deed while he was grieving his wife's death. His case was still working through the legal system, but the support group had provided the community and validation he needed to persist despite family pressure to let it go for the sake of peace. Peace, James said with bitter recognition, was what my daughter-in-law wanted me to choose instead of justice. She wanted me to accept being homeless so she could avoid facing consequences for her criminal behavior. This group taught me that peace without justice isn't peace at all, it's surrender. The third speaker was Maria Santos, whose role had evolved from Margaret's physical therapist to co-facilitator of the support group. Her own mother had been victimized by financial scams, and her professional experience with elderly patients had given her insight into the patterns of exploitation that families often dismissed as helping with finances. What I've learned from working with Margaret and all of you, Maria said, her warmth filling the room with the kind of acceptance that made difficult conversations possible, is that protecting our elders means more than just meeting their physical needs. It means respecting their autonomy, honoring their intelligence, and refusing to let anyone, including family members, treat them as if age has made them incompetent. After the formal presentations, the group broke into smaller circles for discussion and mutual support. Margaret moved between these clusters, offering encouragement, sharing resources, connecting people with similar experiences. This had become her calling, not just recovering from her own victimization, but creating the community support system she wished had existed when she was struggling alone with Sarah's betrayal. Elena worked the room with professional efficiency, distributing information about legal resources, scheduling consultations with seniors who needed representation, coordinating with Detective Morrison and other law enforcement officers who specialized in elder abuse cases. The partnership between Margaret's advocacy and Elena's legal expertise had proven remarkably effective, with their collaborative approach resulting in successful outcomes for dozens of families. Margaret, Elena said as they packed up materials, after the session ended, I have news about the Legislative Committee hearing next week. Senator Williams wants you to testify about the need for stronger penalties for family members who commit financial elder abuse. Margaret smiled at the irony. 6 months ago, she had been terrified to confront Sarah about forged documents. Now she was being asked to address state legislators about changing laws to better protect seniors from family exploitation. What's the focus of the proposed legislation? Mandatory reporting requirements for financial institutions, enhanced penalties when the perpetrator is a family member, and funding for legal aid programs specifically targeting elder abuse cases. Your story, the fact that you almost lost. Everything because existing laws didn't adequately protect you. That's exactly what legislators need to hear. As they drove back to Margaret's house, Elena's phone buzzed with messages from potential clients, requests for speaking engagements, and invitations to collaborate with other advocacy organizations. The ripple effects of Margaret's case had extended far beyond personal justice to systemic change efforts. "Elena," Margaret said as they pulled into her driveway, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't fought back? If I had just accepted what Sarah did and tried to live with the consequences?" Elena considered the question seriously. "I think you would have lost everything. Your house, your financial security, your sense of self-worth. But more than that, Sarah would have gotten away with criminal behavior, which would have emboldened her to victimize others. And all the people we've helped through the support group, all the cases we've won together, none of that would have happened." They were interrupted by Grace and Sophie bursting through the front door, their teenage energy filling the house with the kind of chaos that had become music to Margaret's ears. The girls had thrived in their grandmother's care, their grades, improving dramatically once they were removed from the toxic environment their parents' conflict had created. "Grandma!" Sophie called out, her artistic portfolio scattered across the dining room table. "I got accepted to the summer arts program at Pika. They loved my series about family and resilience." Margaret examined Sophie's artwork, powerful pieces that explored themes of betrayal, healing, and the difference between biological and chosen family. The 14-year-old's artistic vision had been deepened by their family's trauma, but rather than being damaged by the experience, she had transformed it into creative expression that spoke to universal themes of love, loss, and recovery. "These are remarkable, Sophie. You found a way to turn our difficult experience into something beautiful and meaningful." Grace looked up from the homework she'd spread across the coffee table, AP coursework that challenged her academically in ways that gave her confidence and purpose. "Elena, will you stay for dinner? Dad's coming over tonight, and we're having family meeting about college planning." The weekly family meetings had become a cornerstone of their reconstructed relationships. David attended regularly, proving, through consistent presence and genuine engagement, that he was committed to rebuilding trust with his mother and daughters. The meetings covered practical matters, finances, school activities, household responsibilities, but they also provided space for the ongoing emotional work of healing family relationships that had been damaged by betrayal and deception. David arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, his punctuality representing one of the many small ways he demonstrated respect for the boundaries Margaret had established. His appearance had improved significantly over the months since his separation from Sarah. He looked healthier, more confident, like someone who had stopped living in constant crisis mode. "Mom," he said, embracing Margaret with the careful affection of someone who understood that physical gestures needed to be earned back through emotional consistency. "How did the support group session go today?" 43 people attended. Elena scheduled consultations with 8 new potential clients. And Senator Williams confirmed that I'll be testifying at the legislative hearing next week about stronger protections for elder abuse victims. David's pride in his mother's transformation was evident in his expression. "I know it's probably strange to say this, but I'm proud of how you've turned what Sarah did into something that helps other people. You've become a voice for seniors who don't know they have rights." The family dinner that followed had become one of Margaret's greatest sources of joy. Not because it erased the pain of Sarah's betrayal, but because it represented what family could look like when built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Grace shared her college application plans, her academic achievements reflecting the stability and support she'd found in her grandmother's house. Sophie discussed her art projects and her growing interest in art therapy as a potential career path. David reported on his work situation. He'd been promoted to senior management after demonstrating the kind of moral leadership that his previous passivity had prevented. Elena, who had become an integral part of these family gatherings, shared updates about their advocacy work and her expanding legal practice. Detective Morrison joined them occasionally, usually bringing news about other elder abuse cases and updates about legislative efforts to strengthen senior protections. "There's something I want to discuss with all of you," Margaret said as they finished Elena's excellent lasagna. Cooking had become another way Elena expressed care for this chosen family. "I've been asked to write a book about my experience with elder abuse and recovery. A publisher contacted me after my testimony at the state seniors conference last month. The response was immediately enthusiastic. Grace, always practical, wanted to know about timeline and how it would affect Margaret's advocacy work. Sophie was excited about the possibility of contributing artwork for the book. David expressed pride that his mother's story would reach an even wider audience. Elena's response was characteristically thoughtful. "Margaret, your story has already helped so many people find the courage to fight back against family exploitation. A book could reach thousands more seniors who are struggling with similar situations." "But," Margaret continued, "I want to make sure I tell the story honestly. That means acknowledging the real costs of fighting back against family abuse. The relationships that were permanently damaged, the trust that can never be fully restored, the ongoing effects of betrayal even after legal victory. That's exactly why people need to hear it," Grace said with 16-year-old wisdom. "They need to know that fighting back is hard and painful, but that the alternative, letting family members get away with criminal behavior, is worse." Later, that evening, after David had returned to his apartment and Elena had gone home, Margaret sat with her granddaughters in what had once been Bill's study and was now their shared homework space. The room had been transformed from masculine retreat to collaborative learning environment, but it still carried echoes of the man whose memory continued to guide Margaret's decisions. "Girls," Margaret said, settling into the chair where she'd once struggled with pain medication and vulnerability, "I want you to understand something important about the path we've traveled together. When your mother betrayed our family's trust, we had choices about how to respond. We could have accepted the abuse to preserve family peace, or we could have fought back even though it meant permanent changes to our relationships." Sophie looked up from her sketch pad, where she was working on a piece about transformation and growth. "You mean we chose justice over fake peace?" "Exactly. And that choice had consequences. Some painful, some wonderful. We lost the family structure we thought we had, but we gained something more valuable, a family built on truth, respect, and genuine care for each other." Grace closed her calculus textbook and gave her grandmother her full attention. "Do you think things would have been different if we'd just tried to forgive Mom and pretend nothing happened?" Margaret considered the question carefully, drawing on the wisdom she'd gained through months of therapy, support group facilitation, and honest self-reflection. "I think forgiveness is a complicated word that people use to mean different things. If forgiveness means accepting criminal behavior to maintain family relationships, then no. That kind of forgiveness would have enabled your mother to continue victimizing people. But if forgiveness means releasing anger that was poisoning our own ability to build healthy relationships, then yes, that kind of forgiveness has been essential to our healing." She gestured around the room, encompassing not just the physical space but everything it represented: safety, stability, intellectual growth, creative expression, honest communication. What we built together, this family, this home, this life, it wouldn't have been possible if we'd chosen to enable criminal behavior for the sake of preserving relationships that were based on deception and exploitation. The conversation was interrupted by the phone ringing, Margaret's personal line, which she kept separate from the advocacy hotline that had been installed for seniors needing support or information. The caller ID showed Elena's number. "Margaret? I'm sorry to call so late, but I just received word about Sarah's situation. She's being released early for good behavior and completion of gambling addiction treatment programs." Margaret felt her chest tighten with old fears before rational thought reasserted itself. Sarah's release didn't change the legal protections that were now in place, didn't threaten the life Margaret had built, didn't have the power to victimize her unless Margaret chose to let it. When? Next month. Her probation officer will be in contact about the restitution payment schedule, but Margaret, she has no legal claim to your property, no access to your finances, no ability to harm you legally or financially. What about Grace and Sophie? Their legal guardianship is permanent unless they choose to change it when they reach 18. Sarah has no parental rights that would allow her to force them to have contact with her. After hanging up, Margaret shared the news with her granddaughters, watching their faces carefully for signs of distress or conflicted feelings about their mother's imminent release. Grace's response was immediate and clear. "I don't want to see her. Not until she proves she's actually changed, not just that she completed prison programs." Sophie's reaction was more complex, her artistic sensitivity making her more attuned to the tragedy of their family's destruction. "I feel sad for her, but I don't trust her, and I don't want her to have the chance to hurt us again." Margaret nodded, proud of her granddaughter's emotional intelligence and clear thinking about protecting themselves from potential future manipulation. "You both understand that those are your choices to make, and that I'll support whatever decisions you make about contact with your mother. But you also understand that our safety and well-being come first, and that family relationships have to be earned through trustworthy behavior over time." The months that followed Sarah's release proved the wisdom of their caution. Sarah made several attempts to contact Margaret directly, sending letters that alternated between apologies and attempts to shift blame for the family's dissolution onto Margaret's vindictiveness and unwillingness to forgive. Margaret shared these letters with Elena and Detective Morrison, who documented them as evidence of Sarah's continued inability to accept responsibility for her criminal behavior. But the letters had no power to disturb the peace Margaret had built. No ability to undermine the security she had established through legal protections and chosen family relationships. David's response to his ex-wife's release was to strengthen his own commitment to the rebuilding work he'd been doing with his mother and daughters. He increased the frequency of his visits, took on more responsibility for Grace and Sophie's college planning, and demonstrated through consistent actions that he understood the difference between the man he had been and the man he was choosing to become. Margaret's book, published 8 months after Sarah's release, became a resource for families dealing with elder abuse and for professionals working with victimized seniors. The speaking engagements that followed took her to conferences across the country, where she shared not just her personal story, but the systemic solutions that could prevent other families from experiencing similar betrayals. "The most important thing I learned," Margaret told audiences from Portland to Miami, "is that age doesn't make us vulnerable to exploitation. Silence does. When we're afraid to name abuse because it comes from family members, when we accept victimization to preserve relationships that don't deserve preservation, when we isolate ourselves rather than seeking help from people who can provide it, that's when we become truly vulnerable." Elena often accompanied Margaret to these speaking engagements, their partnership having evolved into a model for collaborative advocacy that combined legal expertise with personal experience. Their joint presentations demonstrated the power of chosen family relationships, the importance of intergenerational support, and the possibility of transforming personal trauma into systemic change. 2 years after the court victory, Margaret stood in her backyard garden, watching Grace and Sophie help Elena plant vegetables for the summer growing season. The garden had been Bill's project during his lifetime, but Margaret had let it go fallow after his death, Now, with help from her chosen family, it was producing food that graced their weekly dinners and provided a space for the kind of collaborative nurturing that characterized their relationships. David arrived for Sunday dinner carrying flowers from his own apartment garden, another sign of the personal growth that had emerged from the crisis that nearly destroyed their family. His relationships with Grace and Sophie had deepened as he proved himself capable of consistent reliability, emotional honesty, and genuine respect for their autonomy. "Mom," David said as they settled around the dining room table where legal documents had once threatened Margaret's security and now advocacy materials planned future protections for other seniors. "I want you to know that what you've built here, this family, this advocacy work, this life, it's exactly what Dad would have been proud of." Margaret smiled, looking around the table at faces that represented not biological destiny, but conscious choice. Not obligation, but genuine affection. Not the family she had been born into, but the family she had decided to create. "I think you're right," she said, raising her glass of wine in a toast to the people who had proven that love was something you did rather than something you claimed. That family was something you built through daily choices rather than something you inherited through accident of birth. "To chosen family," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned through experience that the strongest bonds were forged through shared values, mutual respect, and the courage to choose truth over convenience. "To chosen family," they echoed, their voices blending in recognition of what they had built together. Not despite the betrayal that had shattered their original family structure, but because of their collective decision to create something better, from the wreckage of what had been lost. Outside, Portland's evening light filtered through the lace curtains Margaret's mother had hung decades earlier, connecting past and present in ways that honored legacy while embracing change. The house that had sheltered 3 generations of Chens continued its protective work, but now it sheltered a family defined not by blood, but by choice, not by obligation, but by love, not by what they had inherited, but by what they had consciously created together. Margaret Chen had begun this journey as a victim of family betrayal. She was ending it as a protector of vulnerable seniors, an advocate for justice, a teacher whose most important lessons had nothing to do with literature and everything to do with the courage required to choose truth over comfortable lies. The woman who had once signed away everything she owned while trusting family who didn't deserve that trust had become someone who helped others understand that trust was something to be earned through consistent action, that family was something to be built through shared values, and that the strongest foundations were often laid after the weakest ones had crumbled completely. As Margaret turned off the lights and secured the locks that protected what truly mattered, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of hard-won peace. The legal victory had restored her property and financial security. But the personal victory, the transformation from isolated victim to community leader, from someone whose trust had been betrayed to someone who could recognize and nurture trustworthy relationships, from a woman whose family had failed her to someone who had created a family worthy of her love. That victory would last for the rest of her life and inspire countless others who would find courage in her example. The house settled into its evening quiet, sheltering not just the people within its walls, but the idea that redemption was possible even after the deepest betrayals, that love could be rebuilt on foundations stronger than those that had been destroyed, and that some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. Margaret Chen slept peacefully in the house her parents had built, surrounded by the family she had chosen, protected by the community she had helped create, secure in the knowledge that what she had built was stronger than what she had lost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve seniors facing exploitation, new chances to demonstrate that age brought not vulnerability, but wisdom, not powerlessness, but the clarity to distinguish between relationships worth preserving and those that needed to be released. But tonight, Margaret rested in the satisfaction of a life rebuilt on foundations of truth, protected by people who had proven their worthiness through actions rather than words, surrounded by the kind of love that grew stronger rather than weaker when tested by adversity. The transformation was complete, but the work, the beautiful, meaningful work of protecting others and building authentic relationships, would continue for as long as Margaret had strength to offer it. And in that continuation, in that commitment to service and truth and chosen family, lay the real victory over those who had tried to exploit her vulnerability and failed to understand her strength. The story that had begun with betrayal ended with triumph, not the simple triumph of legal victory, but the complex triumph of a life rebuilt according to one's own values, relationships chosen for their authenticity rather than their convenience, and the discovery that some losses cleared the way for gains too precious to have been possible without them. Margaret Chen had lost the family she was born into, but she had found the family she was meant to have, and in that finding, she had discovered not just her own strength, but the template for helping others discover theirs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.